Hello, welcome to When Good Things... No, that's not
Good things happen to bad people. Today we're... Oh, God, that's good.
Hey, listeners. This is When Bad Things Happen to Good People, a podcast that was plagued by some issues this week. Before you get listening, I wanted to warn you that the audio quality is not super good. We encountered some problems. I was speaking into the wrong side of my microphone, and I think Oren, his system was set up to use the wrong microphone. So neither of us sound particularly good. I am pretty sure it was the fault of the lack of lucky beer, which you will hear about once you get into the podcast proper. But we're going to put this out as it is. Oren has worked what magic he can on the audio that we have. We continue to learn lessons as we produce these things, and hopefully the next next episode will sound back to normal again. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for listening, and enjoy. Well, how are things, Oren?
Not too bad. How about you?
They're okay. I have a confession. I wasn't able to... I have, so far, I have a Lucky Podcast beer. I don't know if I've told you this. But every time that we've recorded so far, I've had a can of... it's a blackberry sour. It's called Dino Sour.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen
it. By Phillips Brewing. It's absolutely delicious. And I've had that every time that we've recorded our podcast so far. And I went to pick one up today to continue the streak of my good luck beer, and they were out. They didn't have any more. And then, so that was bad enough. But to make matters worse, I intended to grab, there was a raspberry wheat beer, also made by Phillips, that was like right next to it, and I was going to grab that. And somehow my brain just shut off completely, and I picked up some kind of fucking Arizona premium vodka hard green tea thing that I had no interest in getting, which is probably full of sugar that I shouldn't be having, but that's what I got here. So let's hope that's not an omen of what's to come on the podcast today. Nah,
I'm sure it'll be fine.
Although, you have a confession too, so...
Yeah, I do have a confession. I, in classic Orange style, am wildly unprepared for this evening. I did not finish the last chapter.
Oh, what?
Yeah, I know. I know, I thought I'd just let you talk about it and just like think, oh yeah, I remember that part. Oh yeah, okay. But I thought I'd be honest and with you.
I appreciate the honesty. I would totally blame this on my not having my good luck beer, but since that was a problem that came after your inability to finish the chapter, I guess it's not responsible.
Well, I mean, if you look at time, as linear and not, shit, I can't remember the name. Have you seen the Good Place? Have you seen that show?
Yeah, I have.
Jeremy Bearimy.
Oh, yeah. Looking at the news, we had some fun semi-censorship news last week that I wanted to bring up ever so briefly. A relation of President Donald Trump, I believe it's his niece named Mary Trump, published a book last week called Too Much and Never Enough about Trump's early life and family life, and there were some people that were, for some reason, trying to prevent the book from being published, and some people that were trying to, I guess she had signed a non-disclosure agreement about certain things, and then just on the day
of release of the book, a judge released her from the obligations of the non-disclosure agreement, so she's able to talk about the stuff that she wasn't supposed to talk about. So that was interesting. I haven't read it, obviously. I shouldn't say obviously. I could have read it, but I didn't. But what I've heard so far is that, it's got some interesting revelations about Trump's youth, including the fact that he apparently paid someone to take the SATs for him. Which, I don't know. That's not surprising. Yeah, no, it seems entirely within his character as far as I can see, but I guess you might say that the most shocking thing is that he actually paid someone.
Didn't just promise payment and then didn't follow
exactly
through.
Yeah.
Hey, if you take my SATs, I'll give you some money. Okay. Yeah, I'll get you next week. What's that saying? If you never want to see somebody again, just lend the money.
Any newsworthy info that you want to talk about? Anything vaguely associated with censorship?
I don't know if it's newsworthy, but I did have a conversation with somebody today who... No, not today. Sorry. When was that? Yesterday. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday who believed that all of this conspiracy theory stuff about how COVID was a government thing, how it was placed here to control the masses. I was actually there for work doing a quote, and it was really difficult to listen to. But she believed that the government was censoring good, honest people trying to get information to the people. When she was talking about these videos that she had seen that had been removed from Facebook. So I guess, in a way that's censorship. They're censoring false information, but the people who believe that information are thinking that it's kind of a government censorship of the truth.
Yeah, they see it as like a suppression of valuable information. That's a bit of a rabbit hole we could go down, and maybe worth a future episode on, how do you draw that line between what is censorship and whether it should be considered censorship. I guess it is in a sense. But,
what censorship is good and what censorship is maybe bad, right? Like, I think that protecting people from false, dangerous information is a good thing. I think that people presenting themselves as experts in a field that they know nothing about, or presenting quote unquote evidence that is untrue, and trying to rally people to a certain belief or to a certain action is dangerous and should be reined in. I do believe in freedom of speech, but I also believe that blatant lying like that shouldn't be allowed. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
For me personally, that is a dichotomy. You can't agree with freedom of speech and also say that something shouldn't be said.
Yeah.
But I do, that a dichotomy exists within me, and I really, in this moment, in this time, with what's going on right now, I'm not ashamed of that.
I think, given, just regarding the, COVID-19 situation, we should all just remember, please wear your masks, wash your hands. And as the BC CDC recommended today, consider using a glory hole if you're going to have sex.
If you're going to have sex with somebody that you haven't been in contact with every day, not your significant other.
Exactly.
If you're going to have a risque encounter, just cut a hole in a piece of plywood and go to town.
Exactly. Yeah. Let's move on before we have an entirely different kind of podcast. I did want to cover a couple of what I'm calling housekeeping bits before we get into the meat of the episode. It's mostly sort of correcting or making notes about last week's episode. First, I wanted to sort of point out that it was kind of... And the thing to remember here is that we're both kind of new to the process of podcasting, and we're very much learning as we go along, and sort of episode by episode, particularly, I know for myself, when I sit down to edit the episode, and as I'm listening back to it, I kind of realize things that we could have done differently or should have done differently. And in the case of last week's episode, I realized that it was kind of all over the place, that we kind of didn't have any actual structure to it. And also at no point did we ever kind of explain, this is the overall story of what occurred over these chapters. And I think that was a mistake. I think, that's something we need to do in the future. So we're going to start doing that with this episode. Another thing that we didn't cover that I think we definitely should have at the very beginning of last week's podcast was talking about why this book has been banned or challenged, because that's the whole subject that we're talking about. That's what we're supposed to be doing here. And so we didn't spend any time at all talking about why the Autobiography of Malcolm X has been banned or challenged in the past. So we'll do that really quickly right now.
Please do, because honestly,
Yeah.
I haven't read on the subject yet, so you are teaching me at the same time.
And it's tricky because so far I don't think we've hit anything in the book that is, that would be considered, dangerous or information worth suppressing.
Are you saying so far as in what we've talked about on the episodes, or so far what we're going to discuss today? Because I would say there was a couple of... Okay. I would say there's a couple of things in the last chapters that we're covering today that were a little on the worrisome side.
Okay, that's fair. So what I found an article, or I found a link on a website called the censorshipfiles.wordpress.com, and they had a whole page explaining or talking about, why the autobiography of Malcolm X had been banned. But I zeroed in on sort of like one paragraph where they were talking about an author or an article called Why the Autobiography of Malcolm X was banned. And they explained that many people labeled it as a guide to crime and chaos, and it included many instances of anti-white statements in its depiction of the intense racial divides at the time. These representations drew criticism and backlash. And actually, I'd say even at the tail end of chapter 10, we might be getting to some of the firsts of those anti-white statements. I guess you wouldn't know that, Oren, because you didn't reading. But
Did you call me a putz?
No.
Oh.
Anyway.
I mean, if the shoe fits, right? But
people described it as kind of a, proposing black on white violence, and that sort of thing. And I imagine we'll see more of that as the book continues. And I imagine too that, given the era, especially in the middle of the civil rights movement, that any kind of messaging that maybe black people should be rising up and taking some power could be received as a little bit threatening.
Right. But also, that brings me back to the foreword written by his son, where he discusses that later on, like near the end of his father's life, how he was expressing more reconciliation-based approaches rather than radical approaches, and how maybe the book doesn't exactly reflect the man that he was at his death, and more maybe the man he was at the time of the writing of the autobiography.
Well, I think it was his relationship with the Nation of Islam religion that resulted in a lot of that sort of pro-violence messaging. And maybe not pro-violence. As I understand it, it's less pro-violence and more pro-defense. That, rising up in defense of yourself is okay.
Like pro-action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But certainly he had left the Nation of Islam before he died, and was changing his viewpoints. And I believe I said to somebody on my Facebook page when talking about this that it's kind of a tragedy. I mean, obviously Malcolm X's death is a tragedy in and of itself, but that we never got a chance to see him and his way of thinking evolve to its full extent over the course of a natural lifespan, given he was killed at 39. But yeah, that's essentially why it's been banned and challenged, more so in the past than recently. So let's get into talking about this week's chapters, which were 6 through 10. You, Oren, I think, had a really interesting way of describing them when you sent me a message about it earlier today. What was the word you choose to use?
Oh. I can't remember.
Oh.
Hold on.
Called it a spiral.
Oh, yes. It was very much listening to this man speak about a dangerous spiral into very immoral, very dangerous, questionable actions. Spiral. That's the word I used.
And it's a good word, I think, because it's very much the first section that we read was all about sort of his childhood, his growing up, and his sort of first experiences out in the world, getting into the big city, and that sort of thing. This is sort of him taking a turn. I don't want to necessarily say for the worse, but certainly into crime and criminality.
Some dark places for sure. He went to some dark places. And I think he kind of touched on it on the chapters before, in his fascination with the people who had lived that life or were currently living that life. And it was, I think the chapters that we went through this time, with exception to the last one,
which you can't speak to,
which I feel were his journey into that lifestyle. Mm-hmm. So chapter 6, Detroit Red, was the first one we went through.
Yeah, and that was sort of, I think at that point, and I don't recall how old he was in these chapters, but still obviously very young. And it's sort of like, at that point, he's just kind of discovering sort of the seedier side of Harlem, gambling, prostitution, and he starts to sell marijuana, or as it's called in the book, reefer.
Reefers,
I absolutely love. Every time I see the word reefer, I think it's cool.
He talks a lot about the numbers too in this episode or this chapter.
Yeah, and at one point, and I can't remember the details, but I remember him explaining how the numbers game worked, and I found that was interesting because he did talk about the numbers game earlier in the book without giving that kind of explanation. And now sort of understanding how it worked, I enjoyed having that, being able to understand it. And I guess he started working in the numbers too. He was taking bets and then bringing the money back to like the people that made the bets, and he was sort of running the bets and the money back and forth for a while.
Right? And it's I think it's of note to point out that these gambling rings are run by white gangsters. So I'm just reading a page here that the white gangsters would describe the game, like the money's or numbers game in Harlem, as N-word pennies, and the numbers game was referred to by the white racketeers as N-word pool. I'm getting tongue-tied because I'm reading the word. It's actually written in the book, and I'm trying madly not to say it because I do not want to say it. And I feel like it's interesting to know that the numbers game was such a big part of these people's lives because it was a chance to get out of poverty, to have something, right? If you wanted numbers, you could buy a nice car, you could have nice women, you could be someone, something that you weren't able to do being strict, just working any job you could get. You wouldn't be able to achieve that kind of status, that kind of money. And it's interesting to know that even the people that were making the most money off of that were white gangsters.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so there was a lot of talk, too, I found in that chapter about male-female relations, and particularly interracial male-female relations. Black women wanting to sleep with white women, black women wanting to sleep with white men. There was a story he shared about a prostitute named Alabama Peach, who desperately wanted to try having sex with a black man. And so she basically blackmailed this dude that worked for her dad into having sex with her, just so she could try it out, see what having sex with a black man was like. And it was like kind of horrifying that someone's life was put on the line just so you could get your thrills. But then I made a note too of some of Malcolm's general comments about women. I guess this is something that he had picked up from the prostitutes. But he said, this is from the book, "A woman should occasionally be babied enough to show her the man had affection, but beyond that, she should be treated firmly. These tough women said that it worked with them. All women, by their nature, are fragile and weak. They are attracted to the male in whom they see strength."
Right.
Which is, obviously that's... Well, some would argue that that's accurate. But it's also, I think, a remnant of the ideas of that era.
Oh, absolutely.
Whether black or white, right?
Yeah. And I got to say that the one thing that really struck a dissonant chord with me through these chapters was his relationship with women and striking of women, which maybe wasn't as big a deal back then, but to me now it was it's quite shocking to hear it spoken so plainly. And I got to give him, props for being very honest, forthright, and he just laid it all out. None of this stuff makes him seem like a good person. None of this stuff makes him seem, holier than thou. He's laying out, he's just describing himself as he was at the time. He's, and at the end of chapter 9, he does bring it up, and he says, maybe I should actually go to that when we get to chapter 9, but he does allude to...
Yeah, he does admit that this is, it's not a glamorous picture of his life, but he wants sort of everyone to see where he came from, to understand sort of where he went.
So I'm interested to know if his approach to women changes later on in the book. It could be that he's just describing the way that he felt at the time, and maybe his feelings towards women evolved as his feelings towards a lot of other things. I'm sure evolved throughout this book. So I'm interested to see where things change for him in that aspect.
Yeah. And then I don't remember if it was this chapter, but in his discussion about, the different hustles that he had at this time, he talked about one that I thought was absolutely brilliant, which was they went to buy this kind of discounted knockoff, not knockoff, but like...
Oh, yeah, with his brother.
Slightly damaged jewelry and things like that.
Well, with his brother, cheap. that was the one, because his brother wanted to hustle a bit, right? And he wanted to give his brother something that if he got caught with, he wasn't going to get in trouble with, right?
Right.
Yeah, that was very, very brilliant. Smart.
Yeah, so they had all of this legit merchandise. They had a legit license to sell it, but then they went into these sort of richer neighborhoods, acted like they had this kind of high-end stolen stuff, and sold it to like white people who didn't know better. And then,
well, they just assumed it was high quality. They just assumed it was hot. They assumed it was stolen.
Yeah, exactly.
Because of the way they acted. Oh, it's brilliant. Yeah, that was brilliant.
And then, if the cops pull them over to say what you're doing, you've got legit merchandise and you have a license to be selling it, as long as the people you're selling to don't see the license.
Yeah, exactly.
You're set.
Yeah.
So that's one of a couple of examples where they sort of used racial prejudice to outsmart people a little bit.
There was a couple instances of that during these chapters. Do you want to go through these chapter by chapter? Is it okay if we jump around a little bit?
If we jump around a little bit, I kind of want to try to work our way through chapter by chapter, but let's jump around if we need to.
I remember...
Do you want to talk about the going up and directly talking to the cops while you're in the middle of a robbery?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, describe that one.
Yeah, so in a couple of cases, they were fleeing from just having robbed a place, and they heard the sirens coming, And instead of running, they would actually approach the cops and flag them down and ask for directions. And the cops would kindly give them directions and then be on their way. The thinking being that in the white police officers' minds, a black person wouldn't be smart enough to come up with that kind of a strategy. And so, yeah, another example of like using that kind of racial prejudice to their advantage. And there were two instances in the book where that happened. One, they were fleeing a robbery, and one, they were in a car. I think they had just had a big robbery on a place and they were driving away, and they pulled over and approached the cops.
Yeah, that was a very smart man, for sure. And it was him in both instances that got out of the car and had done that. But the thing I was referring to was the train hopping. So he still had his ID from when he worked as what was his role on the train? He would sell items on the train. He was kind of like,
yeah, he sold sandwiches and coffee and stuff.
But he still had his railroad ID, and to get free rides, he would show his ID and just say, "Oh, I gotta get home to my family." And same thing, he would describe it as, no white conductor would think that a black man would be smart enough to, pull the wool over his eyes, and that he must be being honest. And he's an employee of the railroad, so hop on.
Yeah.
So I think those were the two instances where he described it that way.
Yeah, and during that time, I think he was bouncing from place to place to sort of stay away from some heat in the city that was closing in on him. And he was
right.
selling reefer in different places. And I think he even talked about selling reefer right on the train.
He was talking about following his musician friends around because they were really good clientele. And when the heat was hitting him in Harlem, he would just find out where they were playing, head there, smoke with them, sell them reefers. I love that word.
Reefer, yeah. Speaking of drugs, another phrase that came up quite a lot that I enjoyed was sniffing of cocaine.
Right.
In modern parlance is like you would snort cocaine, which sounds much more violent.
Right.
But he talked about sniffing cocaine, which I thought was an interesting word choice. Maybe they did it a little more peacefully back then.
I doubt it.
Anyway, moving on to Chapter 7, Hustler.
Hustler, yeah.
Which saw, obviously, more hustling. That was his first foray into robbery in that chapter, I believe.
Oh, okay. Now, which
that's...
Was this the chapter where he was falsely accused of robbery? Because he was a tall, light-skinned redhead.
Yeah, that's where the Italians were trying to... some Italians got involved and tried to sort of take him out.
And he had a lot of close calls.
Yeah. That was also when he ended up in kind of a confrontation with Sammy the Pimp's girl, which is something you would talk about.
Yep. Yeah, that one struck me hard in a lot of ways. It was the striking of Sammy's girl and Sammy pulling a gun on him. Mm-hmm. And Sammy's girl, seeing that and being like, you gotta get the fuck out of here. Basically rushed him out of there, and how that ruined him and Sammy's friendship. Mm-hmm. That was, I think, a very striking moment.
Yeah, and there was a paragraph at the end of that sequence that stood out to me as being kind of... It almost oversimplified the situation, but it reads, "We soon made up, on the surface, but things never are fully right again with anyone you have seen trying to kill you." Yeah, okay, that's fair. I can see that.
He's like, "Hey, bud, you want to go get a drink? But I'm not turning my back on you."
Yeah, no, maybe if I pat you down first.
Yeah. No, it's it just kind of plays to the kind of state of mind that all of them were in, And like you mentioned in the previous episode, where he does discuss it again in these chapters, how he believes that he will die of a violent death. So that's twice that he said that. himself. It just plays to the mindset that they were in. That was the life that they lived. There was guns, there was violence, there was danger around every corner, and during these chapters, the danger becomes more and more apparent, more and more in your face. I just can't imagine. And he talks about having to do a lot of drugs to cope with that. The amount of stress that somebody must be in that situation.
That's just something we see over these chapters is the increase in his drug intake as well. Starting with just sort of marijuana use, and then going up into sniffing cocaine, and
it seems to be to me. It seems to be directly correlated with his spiral. To use my own word, no.
And I think that spiral, some of that was, and some of the drug use too, I think was, because the further into this he got, the more dangerous the entire situation became.
Yeah.
So he was always kind of on the lookout, trying to make sure that, he wasn't being hunted down by, a group of Italians or,
right.
People who thought that he was the guy who robbed this place because he was a lighter black man with red hair, and just escalated and escalated and escalated.
And I think that the drug use just kind of followed that escalation. And it's interesting. It's one of those cause and effect situations. Which is the cause? Which is the effect? Right. And I think in his situation, definitely the drug use was the effect. I don't think it was the cause of the danger. I think that his decisions were the cause of the danger. Being more blatant, being more, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it. But, he was just so much more involved in crime and in that whole, kind of underworld. And the farther he got in that, the more danger he was in, and the more he needed to drug himself to kind of forget. He spoke about, the drugs would help him push the danger to the back of his mind so it wasn't in his face all the time.
And so things continued to escalate through chapter 7 and into chapter 8, which is called Trapped. And that maybe gives a sense of, what his emotional state was at that point in time as he's, trying to juggle his hustles, his other criminal activities.
So,
with everything kind of closing in on him.
Right. Is Trapped where he begins the robberies, or was 7 where he began the robberies?
I have in my notes that 7 was when he began the robberies. But
and that included Rudy, Sammy, or Shorty, because he had moved at this point. He had left Harlem because of the heat.
No, I don't think he leaves Harlem until the end of chapter 8.
Okay, so these aren't the orchestrated robberies. These are the holdups. He did a couple of holdups, right?
Yeah. Right.
Oh, okay.
But I don't have a lot of notes on chapter 8, so we can push on to chapter 9. Which is when he leaves Harlem. Unless you've got stuff to say about chapter 8.
Well, I think chapter 8 was where the drug abuse really became an issue. That's when he was really afraid for his life. That would have been when West Indian Archie was after him because he believed that he cheated on the numbers. So I'll describe that situation. So Malcolm had this relationship with this man named West Indian Archie. And West Indian Archie was a numbers runner. He was a very big guy. Very tough. Nobody messed with him. And he was really good with numbers. Very smart man. If you gave him the numbers that you wanted to bet on, he wouldn't write it down. He would remember and then write them down when he got to the people that needed the numbers, right? So if he was ever caught, he wouldn't have the numbers on him, kind of a thing.
Right.
And he would also carry around a few $1,000s of his own money. And if you hit big on the numbers, he would pay you out of pocket and then get paid by the racketeers. So he was, kind of putting out his own money to keep things rolling keep things good. He was a really good numbers guy. So what ended up happening was Malcolm had hit big. Not super big. I think it was $300. Is that right?
I think that's what.
Yeah, it wasn't like one of those 6-to-1s that he talks about where some people get like $9,000, which back then would have been absolutely insane.
Yeah.
But yeah, he told West Indian Archie, he's like, hey, I hit at 15 or whatever to one at $2 or I can't remember what it was, but it came out to $300. West Indian Archie pulled out his wad of money, gave Malcolm $300, and Malcolm.
Which again, I think it's worth noting that wasn't always the norm.
No.
Oftentimes the runner would go back. Usually the runner would go back, get the money, and then bring it back and pay you. But West Indian Archie, like just to sort of streamline the process, and one of the reasons that he was such a popular runner is that he would do that. He would trust you, he'd pay you right then, and then he'd go back and get paid out himself. By the whoever. And
I think that Malcolm also said that he didn't do that for everybody. Just people that he knew. So they had a pretty decent relationship, I think, before this point. And it doesn't really, and I don't think Malcolm ever really understood, like really knew himself if he had just misinterpreted his numbers or if West Indian Archie had lied to him. But West Indian Archie came after him for his life, threatening the people that knew Malcolm, saying that Malcolm cheated him, said he hit when he didn't, and that he owed him $300. And it was just interesting, to hear Malcolm explain his thought process, because it wasn't that he didn't have the money.
Yeah, exactly. He said he still had like $200 of the money,
plus whatever he was getting with his own hustles, right? So he could have done it.
It was more about their battle of reputations, right?
Right. So, but that's a terrifying man to be in that situation with, and his drug input increased after that, and that I think that was the main reason for him leaving Harlem. He didn't run; he did stay probably longer than I think I would have. If somebody was like, put a gun on me, I think I'd be like, yeah, all right. I think my time in this town is done. I'll see you later. I'll go somewhere else. It was just a wild. I think this was not his rock bottom, but definitely his rock bottom in Harlem.
Yeah, and then was it Shorty who shows up?
Was it Shorty? Yeah, Shorty. Yeah, that's right. And that's when he ends up moving back to Boston.
Yeah, he's like, hey, let's get out of here.
And he does. Yeah, and he does. But that was a wild thing.
Anyway, that brings us to chapter 9. It's called Caught, even though Caught won't actually happen until the end of the chapter, which I guess is a bit of a spoiler. But
okay. So I was talking about chapter 8. I'm sorry. I thought I was giving deposition on previous chapters, but I was wrong.
Yeah, no, that was chapter 8, and in chapter 9 is when he's back in Boston, and sort of gets into criminal activity again there, getting into burglary, which I thought they had a pretty good setup for that as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Where they had they basically had they had a group of, I think, 5, and they had 2 women. Okay,
so it was Ella and her sister.
Yeah, Ella being the white woman that Malcolm X had an ongoing sort of affair with.
Oh no, that's Sophia. Ella.
Sophia.
Yeah, Sophia. So Ella is his half sister.
Oh, no. Then it's Sophia that's in the robbery with them, isn't it?
Yeah, Sophia's in the robbery with him, yeah.
Right, yeah. Sophia and Sophia's friend.
No, Sophia's 17-year-old sister.
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's good.
Sophia and Sophia's 17-year-old sister would kind of go out door to door, asked to come in the house. I can't remember what they were asking to come in for. But they would come in, and while they were there, they would sort of stake out these houses and get a look at what kind of expensive stuff was in there, what kind of valuables, where the valuables were located. And then they would decide which houses were worth going back to and burgling under cover of darkness. 2 of them would go in to burgle, Malcolm X and another fella, while one remained in the car with the motor running for a speedy getaway.
Right. So it was Sophia's sister, Malcolm, Shorty, and Rudy. And I think it was Rudy that had scoped the first place that they burgled because he. And do you remember this story with the old man who wanted to be treated like a baby?
Yes,
the
I
old
do
white
remember
man.
that.
Oh man, that was weird. Do you want to describe it?
Speaking of that,
yeah, go ahead.
well, it was just that like this old man wanted to. He hired. Who did he hire again?
Rudy. Yeah.
To come in, and he would the old man would sort of lie on this table, all curled up like a baby, and he would want to be have baby powder applied to him.
Yeah, well, I guess Rudy would like pick him up and place him on the bed, and then spray talcum powder on him, and that would be enough for the old man to climax.
Yeah,
and like,
which, I mean,
oh my god, like that.
Kink shame here.
Well, I mean, we don't kink shame, but oh man, I don't know. Do we kink shame? We don't.
No, I don't kink shame.
All right, if you do that, you're fine.
Kink-friendly podcast.
You're cool.
I don't want to do that.
You're cool, but don't just attack a visible minority to get your kicks off. And I think that was one thing that Malcolm was getting to, was that a lot of these people who had these really extreme kinks, and they wanted to exercise them. They wanted to get that release, right? Their pent up sexual desires, these weird kinky things, would turn to the black population because they could feel like they could use them for these things without fear of any information spreading, without fear of, it was kind of like a safe place for them to use these people for their own weird, twisted sexual fantasies. Does that make sense?
There was an element of that, I think, certainly, but then there were other times, because in earlier chapters, Malcolm X talked about, working in someone in the prostitution industry who was
right.
Called he did steering.
Steering, and I like. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but
no, but I mean, it was one of the things that disappointed me in that area of the book was he would talk about like, man, I've seen things you wouldn't believe, and then didn't spend much time talking about those things, and I was.
You're like, what were they, Malcolm?
Hoping I'd find out how bad these things were.
I mean, if he talked about the pampering and the baby powder thing and the man getting whipped, but he wouldn't talk about these other things, like, what were they?
Yeah, well, and it's the whipping that I kind of wanted to talk about because, he talked about how there were these white guys that wanted to be whipped specifically by a black woman, and like the blacker the better.
Mm-hmm.
And I do wonder whether there was a racial element to that beyond the whole, this is someone who won't reveal my secrets to my peers. It almost feels like there's maybe a hint of white guilt or a sexualization of the black race as this kind of violent savage, or like there's something deeper to that particular kink.
Yeah, it'd be
just
yeah. It'd be interesting to know. I mean, I guess we can't at this point, but if, like you say, it was more of this the savagery that they felt that these people possessed, or if it was just a physical prowess, maybe they recognized that, and that was something that turned them on, more than just the, I don't want to say savage.
The fact that it would be sort of kept secret, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, I didn't want to use the word savagery again. I wanted to go in a different direction, but because I feel like those are two different things. Like you can be, physically not endowed, but very savage in your approach to the way you do things, right? But it would be interesting to know which side of that these people at that time were more drawn to. The freedom that savagery brings, or, the physical dominance.
But knowing that, there can be, there's no knowing, obviously. It's just interesting to think that with that kink in particular, there could be kind of multiple reasons behind where that connection to being sexually gratified came from. Now, we eventually at chapter 9 get to Malcolm finally, everything catches up to him and he is arrested.
Yes.
In kind of a dumb way too, really. He had brought, I believe, a watch a watch that he had stolen.
Right.
Into a jewelry shop to have it repaired. And it was recognized as something that had been stolen.
Well, the person that owned it prior. I can't even talk. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he had reached out to jewelers and said, like, piece has been stolen. It requires this. It had this defect. It needs to be repaired.
Yeah. And so when the shop got the watch, they had known it was stolen. They reached out to the police. And the police were sort of waiting there when Malcolm came in to pick up the watch. And bing, bang, boom, he was caught. And apparently was maybe on the verge of getting killed right there. Because as the cop came out to arrest him, another guy comes through the door. And the cop turns to sort of guide the person back out again. And I guess in that moment, Malcolm X had considered pulling his gun and shooting the cop and getting away. But instead, took his gun out and sort of put it down on the counter and gave up, only to realize that there were, one or two more cops in the jewelry store who certainly would have shot him.
Right.
Had he shot the cop.
Yeah, so he thought about killing the cop and then decided to just gesture to the cop, like, get my gun, because it was in his belt, and realized that there was two other cops in there. So if he would have shot the cop, he wouldn't have got away. He would have been killed. Were you going to touch on Sophia's husband at all during this?
Oh, yeah.
Because
that's a big part of that chapter that I just kind of blew over. So you can go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah, I feel like, when it comes up to him getting caught, like, he was playing with fire all around. He was just unhinged, It almost felt like he was really acting out in a lot of ways. And maybe dropping that watch off was a bit of acting out as well. Maybe he felt, fuck him, I'm not going to get caught. Whatever. Yeah. I know that this is stolen. I know that, it's dangerous. It's got it's a very specific piece. It's got a very specific defect on it. Maybe he was just like, fuck it, whatever. But one day he walks into one of his favorite pubs, and the waiter looks at him and gives him this funny look like, hey man, like, something's not right here, right? And he walks in and he sees Sophia sitting down with a white man across the table. And it's not Sophia's husband. I'm not sure if he knew that at the time. But he realizes that he describes it in this way, and this is kind of information that I don't think he would have had at the time, but he says that a friend of Sophia's husband had been spending time with Sophia because Sophia's husband was out doing a salesman thing because he was no longer in the army. And he really wanted to go to this, I don't know can I say Negro?
Yeah, Negro's fine.
Okay, that's how he described it, like a Negro gathering place, a Negro bar. And Sophia didn't want to go, because she had been there a lot with Malcolm and with Short.
Didn't want that to kind of get out.
Well, exactly, right? And so he wouldn't take no for an answer. They end up going, and she's, he describes it as, she wasn't, maybe they talked afterwards, I'm not sure, about how she was hoping that nobody would recognize her and come up and be like, hey, Sophia, how are you, right? Because she was a regular, everybody knew her. And Malcolm, he saw this happen. He could have just sat down, had a drink, and let it be. but he didn't. He got up, he walked over to Sophia and Sophia's husband's friend and struck up a conversation, called her baby, and just made it very, very obvious that her and him were a thing. And they had been for several years, I think even before she had met her husband.
Yeah.
And I think what you're talking about when you said that somebody came into the jewelry store wanting to kill Malcolm, I think what you were getting at was...
No, I never said the person that came into the jewelry store wanted to kill him.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. My bad. But somebody else did
Just that someone came into the jewelry store, and it was when the cop was trying to usher that guy back outside because they were dealing with the arrest. That's when the cop turned his back.
That's when he could have killed him, but he didn't, and if he would have been dead. Okay, I gotcha.
Yeah.
But somebody did want to kill him that day. Because while he was at the police station, Sophia's husband, with a gun, went to his apartment and was ready to kill him. So
getting arrested might have turned out to be a very lucky thing for him.
Oh, absolutely. And I think in more ways than two. First being he didn't shoot the cop and then get killed there in the jewelry store. For two, he didn't go home and get shot by Sophia's husband.
Yeah.
And for three, it gave him the opportunity. I'm not saying it was a good thing. But I think, and I haven't read chapter 10, and I apologize, but the way that I feel it's going is his time in prison is where he starts to find himself in the way that really feels good to him.
Well, he definitely finds the Nation of Islam, which I guess we can start moving on to chapter 10. Satan.
This is all you, bud. Teach me.
Which is, it's called Satan because he ends up with that nickname in prison. While he's being sentenced, he kind of gets the sense that because he ends up getting kind of maximum sentences for these crimes. Mm-hmm. And he starts getting the sense that it has less to do with the crimes themselves than it has to do with the fact that he involved these upstanding white women in these crimes. Like, that's the real crime that he committed, was dragging these clean, the perfect white women down into these horrible black crimes.
Well, and even just being with them.
Mm-hmm.
I did read part of it.
Yeah, exactly. That was one of the things his lawyer said, like, you didn't have any right being with those white women.
And then the one person was asking him, like, did you sleep with her? And he was like, well, what do you think? Right?
I made a note of this. I think that's when he was first brought to prison, or... Yeah, he got 10 years. This was in February 1946. I wasn't quite 21. I had not even started shaving. So everything we've covered so far just gets us to almost the age of 21.
Which is crazy.
It's crazy. So there he is behind bars. Kind of doing okay. Trading cigarettes, hoarding cigarettes for money. Figures out how to get high on nutmeg. And then he gets kind of a weird note from his family that tells him to quit smoking and stop eating pork. He thinks this has some kind of ploy to get him out of prison. And he thinks, actually, it reminds him of how he got out of the military, which we didn't talk about, but ever so briefly. In chapter 6, I believe, he gets drafted, but when he goes in to sort of follow up, he pulls this kind of crazy act out where he implies that he, correct me if I'm wrong, but he kind of implies that he wants to sort of get his hands on some weaponry and shoot a bunch of white people.
No, that's exactly what he said, yeah.
Yeah. And so they basically, stamped him not fit for service, and he never heard from the military again. And so when his family tells him to stop smoking cigarettes and to stop eating pork, his first thought is that this is going to be part of that sort of thing, that they're going to create some kind of weird, crazy defense to get him out of prison. Mm-hmm. But it gradually just becomes, I believe, sort of the first steps towards joining the religion of the Nation of Islam, which I'm not going to get super into right now, because I imagine there's going to be even more of it in the chapters to come. But it is very much a religion focused on the concept of black superiority. It was created, I want to say, sort of in the 1930s, but I probably have that date wrong. But it's very much, it came out of blacks in America. And so, as you know, Oren, I'm not a religious person. I'm an atheist. I believe you are as well.
Very much so.
So when I look at religion, quite often I see, I can see how people are either drawn to religions that already support their beliefs, or stick within ones because they were raised within those beliefs. But, I think, for example, someone who already believes that homosexuality is wrong is going to be drawn to that sort of religion, right? Religion sort of helps shape your beliefs or encourage them. And when you look at the Nation of Islam, it's definitely a religion that evolved out of the persecution of African Americans, of feeling like they were, and rightly so, absolutely taken advantage of by white men for generations. Okay, so here's a point I want to make, because there's a difference between Islam and the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam, as a name, belongs to this religion that came out of African Americans in the United States.
Okay, and the religion of Islam is an ancient.
Yes.
From the 7th century.
And
the
Nation of Islam does build from some Islamic beliefs, I believe.
Okay, so
I will admit that I haven't read too much on the Nation of Islam, but it does seem to be somewhat connected. But they also believe specifically that that the black race is the superior race, that white men are devils that were created to oppress them. So it is very much a somewhat racially intolerant religion.
Right. Is that dripping happening on your end or mine?
Oh, that's on my end, sorry.
Okay.
That is my, what's it called? My aero garden, my indoor...
Oh, okay.
That I grow my salad greens in. It's watering time.
Todd Sullivan, ladies and gentlemen, not just a very intellectual man, but also a grower of shit. Cool stuff.
Yeah, I got my...
What you got? What you got in there?
Indoor grow up here.
What you got in there?
Salad greens.
Is it? You know, like herbs? Just salad greens?
Yeah, well, I had herbs growing at one time, but I didn't know what to do with them, and I didn't cook with them often enough, so it didn't seem worthwhile. Whereas to be able to just like rip out a bunch of handfuls of varying salad greens at dinner time to make a quick salad, I dig that quite a lot.
Gotcha. So sorry to take you off topic.
That's okay.
I'm very, and I think maybe a lot of people who are listening as well might be very interested to know that Islam and the Nation of Islam are two very different things.
Yes.
I did not know that.
Yeah, I'm going to actually do a very quick Wikipedia check. Yeah, it was started in 1930. Its stated goals are to improve the spiritual, mental, social, and economic condition of African Americans. Critics have described the theology of the organization as promoting anti-Semitism and anti-LGBT rhetoric, and of promoting racial separatism, black nationalism, and of having promoted black supremacist beliefs in the past.
Okay.
The Southern Poverty Law Center tracks the NOI as a hate group, which it claims teaches a theology of innate black superiority over whites, which does appear to be accurate in the way that it's initially talked about in the Autobiography of Malcolm X.
Okay, well, I feel that is a huge distinction with very few words. Because I honestly assumed Malcolm X was
a Muslim.
Was a Muslim. I didn't realize that being a Muslim and being a member of the Nation of Islam were two different things.
Yeah. And I seem to recall, and I can't remember if it was I think it was in that chapter, in chapter 10, where he talks about going to Mecca and speaking there with Muslims who were criticizing the Nation of Islam for kind of bastardizing the Islamic religion, and him basically saying that was their fault for not doing enough to spread that religion to the West. I believe.
Okay.
That's kind of the anecdote that he shot.
I do have a cousin who is Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, a few cousins. My cousin, her two sons are all Muslim, and definitely the way that they describe it, it's a religion of peace. It's a religion of inclusivity. It's not they don't practice it in any divisive way. So yeah, when you were talking about it, I was like, oh yeah, I was ready to fight you. I was like, nah, man, like that's not how it is. You got it wrong, bro. But like I said, to know that it's two completely different things is mind boggling, because it just to my mind, from what I know, which is very limited. When you think Islam, you think Muslim, I wouldn't make any distinction between the two. So it's really, really interesting to know. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, you would have figured that out if you just finished the chapter, but...
Oh, damn! Okay. And the shadow is cast.
I believe it was Malcolm's sister, Ella, and a couple of his brothers who had now joined the Nation of Islam and were encouraging him to as well. And that's, they also talk about how all of the other races, the 200-year span was needed to eliminate on the island of Patmos all of the black people until only brown people remained. The next 200 years were needed to create from the brown race the red race with no more browns left on the island. And another 200 years from the red race was created the yellow race. 200 years later, the white race had at last been created. The island of Patmos was nothing but these blonde, pale-skinned, cold blue-eyed devils. Savages, nude and shameless. Hairy like animals, they walked on all fours, and they lived in trees. 600 more years passed before this race of people returned to the mainland among the natural black people. Mr. Elijah Muhammad teaches his followers that within 6 months' time, through telling lies that set the black men fighting among each other, this devil race had turned what had been a peaceful heaven on earth into a hell, torn by quarreling and fighting. But finally, the original black people recognized that their stubborn trouble stemmed from this devil white race that Mr. Jacob had made. They rounded them up, put them in chains with little aprons to cover their nakedness. This devil race was marched off across the Arabian desert to the caves of Europe.
Wow. Okay, there's a lot to unpack there.
There is a lot to unpack there. Oh, here we go, yeah.
Okay.
I was to learn later that Elijah Muhammad's tales, like this one of Jacob, infuriated the Muslims of the East. While at Mecca, I reminded them that it was their fault, since they themselves hadn't done enough to make real Islam known in the West. Their silence left a vacuum into which any religious faker could step and mislead our people. So, from that, it seems that perhaps later in his life, he does become a more traditional Muslim, but still in that moment says that, because Islam was not properly spread to, European countries or the West, it allowed for this misinformation or this false religion to kind of fill that void. But I imagine this is not the last we will hear of the Nation of Islam, and I'm sure it will make for some interesting reading as we move forward.
It's jarring to hear that kind of talk as a white person. It's hurtful, right? And but that's what people of color have lived with for forever. You know, they've been pointed out, they've been segregated, they've been, and to have it happen to you, to happen to the color of your skin, it's hard, it's hurtful.
Totally, yeah.
Something I don't think I've really experienced before. There's that white privilege again, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't blame anybody who's been persecuted, who's been segregated to, latch on to something like that. Absolutely. If you've spent your life being told you're less than, but in your mind you've seen that you are equal or better to, and somebody comes along and tells you that, you're the true race, right?
Mm-hmm.
You would latch onto that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like I said, it's hard to hear, but to absolutely understand how that would be so alluring.
And it's interesting to think too that that's a religion that remains active.
I mean, it's not that surprising. Racism's still active.
Yeah, no, like I was saying, like I can totally get how that, having been oppressed for generations, that would be an appealing message that, this is why you were oppressed and you are the chosen people and you need to rise up and defeat the white demons.
I'm really curious to see where he goes from here.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
It's very interesting to get this kind of insight into a mind like his. A very intellectual person who has been suppressed, has been through the things that he's been through. I'm actually really, really, really glad that you picked this book.
You picked this book, dude.
I did?
Yeah, I gave you a couple of choices and you picked this one.
Oh, well, that was one of your choices, so you picked it as a choice. So, I'm giving you credit.
Okay, you deserve all the credit. So I think that brings us to a close. Looking ahead to next episode, this one is coming out late. My hope is that we'll be able to record next week and get back on track and have this one out on I guess that'd be the first Sunday of August. Fingers crossed. We will be covering chapters 11 through 16, which is about 150 pages. So only about, I think, 10 pages more than we covered. No, I'm lying. Chapters 11 through 15 is about 150 pages.
Okay.
And that's what we'll be covering next time. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Todd Sullivan.
And I'm Oren Barter.
There's Oren Barter.
That's so good.
Until then, I'm Todd Sullivan.
And I'm Oren Barter.
This has been When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Thanks for listening. Now, go read a fucking book.